Like it or not, a significant number of gamers habitually invert their camera controls. Seth Rogen does it, and he's the cool weed guy from films.
Wait, I need to invert my look.
Don't waste time. Don't do that.
Okay, I won't.
And everyone thinks they know why invert Y is a thing, but it turns out many of the assumptions we make about this are frankly wrong, and boffins have proved it in tests. In terms of sheer numbers, inverters versus non-inverters is the biggest schism in the game community. Whenever the subject comes up, it always leads to some petty argument about how you tilt your head when you look around in real life versus, no, up means up, loser. Your head is not a tiny aeroplane. Well, maybe my head is a tiny aeroplane and my brain is the pilot. Just stop being weird. And inverters are at a massive disadvantage in these matters because invert rhymes with pervert. Oh yeah, up means down, does it? Whatever. Inverti perverti. Non-inverters or normal people think inverters or weirdos are weirdos. But for one of these groups, it is merely a fact of life, whether nature or nurture. To those of us afflicted with the scourge of invertism, a stigma I have lived with for most of my life. Pushing forward on a stick to look down comes just as naturally as walking, breathing, or being baffled by the apparent popularity of British TV and radio presenter Chris Evans. Do you like him? No. Do your parents like him? No. Ever met anyone who likes him? No. But he's one of the most highly paid broadcasters in the country. Somehow, he's normal. He's part of the furniture in England, as ubiquitous as a fly-tipped sofa at the side of the road. Normality is just a matter of perception, or in Chris Evans's case, 30 years of career gaslighting.
Big ass.
There's a lot of misconceptions about inverters perpetuated by people on either side of the divide. That people who invert are outliers, that it's some kind of skill issue, that it doesn't make sense to invert Y if you aren't also going to invert X, that it's easy to switch with a bit of practice, that it all depends on what your first game system was. According to researchers Jennifer Corbett and Jack Manecki, who surveyed a big sample of gamers and subjected them to cognitive 3D spatial awareness testing, presumably with the promise of KFC vouchers, whether or not you played Microsoft Flight Simulator as a child has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on your Y-axis praxis. But though this study has gone some way to disproving these commonly held myths, it stops short of providing any real answers about why some people invert and why others do not. Largely, I suspect, because that's rather like trying to explain the briefs or boxers divide, in that there's an unknowable number of factors to consider why someone would have a preference, and it doesn't matter anyway because it's just pants. And only matters to the individual concerned. It's not like one day they're going to stop making boxers. I think this analogy's got away with me a little bit.
Well, you can tell they're not real gamers, they've got a skincare routine.
Except, as the study sort of says if you read it, it's not just a personal preference. Well, it is, but it's one that's massively dictated by how your brain happens to be wired, how it handles spatial awareness. Although with practice and perseverance, some people have found that they can unlearn their default and switch over. Usually this is from inverting to not inverting, because why would you go the other way? It's kind of halfway between a personal preference and an accessibility issue. It's a bit of both. And understanding it may well be crucial for important things beyond the realm of gaming, such as telesurgery or drone operation, all kinds of applications where the operator's spatial awareness is being distorted by a non-standard field of view, the lack of a third dimension, input lag, frame drops, anything you can imagine. I don't know, I'm guessing. I'm not trying to get a research grant, so I'm not that invested in whether or not that's a convincing pitch for how serious this issue is, because I don't think it is. What's incredible about the study's findings is that, and I'm quoting the researchers from an article in The Guardian here, none of the reasons people gave us for inverting controls had anything to do with whether they actually inverted. So, all of us are arcing down the wrong tree, and it actually has more to do with how you process 3D space at a deep cognitive level. This absolutely tracks with my own limited, tiny sample size research. I took a poll of IGN Entertainment staff recently and found that firstly, of the 35 people who responded to my survey, only 7 of us are inverters. And of those 7, beyond the inverting, there wasn't a single unifying factor apart from the fact that we're all over 30. But most people at the company are over 30, so that hardly feels like a significant marker. I asked people to check which control scheme or device they used first, It was a mix of control pad and joystick. Interestingly, no inverters mentioned mouse and keyboard, which may be significant. Very few people seem to invert on mouse look, which makes sense to me. I don't, despite being a hardwired inverter when it comes to anything with a stick. Essentially, your crosshair just becomes a mouse pointer when you're in the middle of a gunfight, right? Some non-inverters did say that they invert for vehicle controls. Eurogamer's Alex Donaldson said anyone who inverts in FPS games is a pervert. The one thing that seems to make you more likely to invert is age, whether or not you're old enough to have been an active gamer in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that certainly makes a lot of sense, because that would roughly cover the heyday of the PS2 and the Nintendo 64, which, as noted by some of my colleagues in the notes, had a lot of popular games where the camera was inverted by default. And it's a period in history where, as an industry, we were trying to get to grips with how you control a character in a 3D environment. It was something that hadn't really been nailed yet. As IGN's Deputy Guides editor Casey DeFreitas writes, I played way too many hours of both Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and Pokemon Snap on the N64, and both of those games required inverted vertical controls. You couldn't change it. It seems mad to think back to that now, but a lot of games back then did invert Y by default because they were treating a little thumbstick on a controller, which was a relatively new thing at the time, like a joystick. And it seemed natural because developers were thinking about the kinds of games that you would play with a joystick. So you can see how that just carried through when analog control became standard on consoles without people really questioning it. Lots of really big games from that time period, huge genre-defining games, shipped with inverted look. Goldeneye 007, another N64 classic and a pioneering first-person shooter on consoles, had an inverted camera. GTA 3, the original PS2 release, notoriously came configured for inverted look without any way to change it, and people just had to deal with it because otherwise there'd be no GTA for them. Many would count Timesplitters on the PS2 as their first encounter with the modern twin-stick control system. Interestingly, this also shipped with inverted Y by default without any way to change it, again forcing a lot of people to just get on with it. Now, I think that's an important part of the story here, the fact that back in the day, even for massive games like those, configuration options in console games, being able to tailor an experience to your own preferences and brain wiring, simply wasn't a thing that you could rely on in every game. Most of the time, you just had to accept whatever the developers shipped it with. And there was no consensus as to how 3D controls should work on a gamepad. It was the Wild West. Conventions we take for granted now, left stick for movement and strafing, right stick for looking and turning, which one did the strafing and which one did the turning wasn't codified for ages, simply hadn't been established, and it's a bit difficult to pin down exactly when they were, because these things tend to change slowly, like an abandoned Freddo melting on a dashboard. Timesplitters certainly didn't invent the modern control scheme. Other console FPSs had it as an option years before. Even Goldeneye 007 had a twin-stick mode utilising two of that machine's ridiculous three-pronged controllers, and they are ridiculous. I hate the N64 so very much. I know a lot of you will be upset about this, but I can't stand the N64 controller. It does my brain in. It upsets me to look at. Alien Resurrection on the PS1 had the modern control system, and interestingly copped a lot of flack from critics at the time who considered it unwieldy and unplayably difficult. Like all major technological and cultural innovations, it turns out a lot of people were stumbling around in the ballpark of what became the accepted solution. Many people credit Halo Combat Evolved with popularising the very concept of first-person shooters on console, not inventing it, but perfecting it with its innovative sticky aiming that made the twin-stick controls we still use today feel good and natural in the hands, and also pioneered this ingenious diegetic method of determining the player's inversion preference, which meant that both types of gamers were catered for in the most natural way possible. The rest is history. Halo eliminating any configuration friction and simply working in whichever way was natural for the individual player probably went a long way toward establishing non-inverted camera controls as society's default. Instinctively, for the majority of people, many playing these games for the first time in their formative years, up means up. This intuitive piece of Halo's tutorial wasn't just a cute way of bypassing menus, it was solving an accessibility problem that was widespread at the time because there were no standards, no hard conventions about how these things were expected to work. Largely because gaming is an industry where a bunch of nerds and computer science Poindexters are making entertainment products for normal people. You know, normal people who own Sony Bravia TVs and sleep in a big bed with their partner.
Today I drank a beer in the bathroom.
In the years since, platform holders have mandated the option of inverting Y alongside other toggles, and it's basically not an issue anymore unless you enjoy arguing about stupid with strangers on the internet. I can't remember being negatively affected by my invertism since Beyond Good and Evil HD came out about 400,000 years ago. In fact, with every new generation it becomes more of a standard practice to cater for as many preferences, impairments, or even disabilities as possible, with many huge mainstream games now including extensive options for fine-tuning everything from camera controls to high contrast overlays for the severely colourblind. I suspect it's more or less impossible to determine exactly why some people invert and some people don't. What I do know is that inverting is wildly misunderstood by non-inverters, while the reverse isn't the case at all. I'm not remotely confused as to why up means up. On paper, that's perfectly intuitive. Up means down, patently is not. And in microcosm, it's a perfect low-key example of why diversity matters in game development. You can't just cater to what is considered normal, otherwise you risk alienating huge swathes of your potential audience, and that's a hard, dispassionate business case for just having some consideration for people who aren't necessarily the default character in life. In the business we call that subtext.